and welcome to the Sunday Shale Show. My name is Mike Chadsey, and today I'm joined by United States Senator John Thune of South Dakota. Senator, welcome to the program.
Good to be with you. Thanks, Mike.
I appreciate it. Thanks for having us. Really what I want to talk about is what's going on in the Dakotas. We're hearing a lot about these shale plays that are happening all over the country. Pennsylvania, New York, Ohio, and certainly up your way. What are some of the things you're seeing and hearing in South and North Dakota?
Well, I mean, obviously in North Dakota, it's very exciting. That's where the big resource is, at least right now. The Bakken play has been enormously helpful in terms of building the economy in North Dakota. Obviously some challenges that come with it as well, but if you look at what it's done to the economy in North Dakota, it's really pretty remarkable. And I think it's encouraging to see us here in this country generating energy in the United States that can be used here and that lessens the dangerous dependence that we have on foreign sources of energy. And of course here in Ohio you have a lot of that as well. And I just hope that we continue to support that. We need to develop these resources. We need to continue to find the new technologies that enable us to harvest those resources here and put them to work for the American economy as opposed to importing energy from other places around the world.
I agree, and that's exactly what we're trying to do here in Ohio. And I've heard you mention that we sort of need an all-the-above approach. Oil, gas, coal, solar, wind. I mean, talk a little bit about where you are in that and what kind of role oil and gas can play in that.
Well, you know, oil and gas and coal, for that matter, too, coal-fired power, we're incredibly dependent upon that in South Dakota. But you've got to have those types of resources available to you, baseload type resources when it comes to electricity production, and then of course fuel production, oil and gas, the way that we heat our homes, everything. You know, developing those resources here at home is really the answer. And of course we have in our state biofuels, some wind. There are other places around the country that have solar, great renewable resources as well. But what we should be looking at is how can we promote domestic production? How can we get greater American supply of energy so that we're not, the demand that we have in this country, which will increase, of course, when the economy starts to pick up again, so that we're not looking elsewhere around the world to places in the world that are particularly unreliable and in many cases just filled with a lot of tumult right now. So I think that having oil, gas, coal, solar, wind, and all of the above strategy, let's support them all. Let's let the market go out there and find those resources in this country and use new forms of technology to access those resources, and let's put them to work here in America.
That absolutely makes sense. I mean, the tagline is sort of, you know, local supply equals less disruptions equals less volatility. I think that's generally a pretty good thing. Now, if we can just delve into for just a moment, here in Ohio, our oil and gas laws are regulated at the state level. There is some talk about moving some of that to the federal level, and there are certain states that are more capable or have a history of oil and gas. Where are you? What do you think the federal government's role in it is regulating oil and gas development?
Well, you know, obviously there are federal laws that any company that does business in this country has to comply with when it comes to the environment and issues related to that. But by and large, I'm a big believer that you have a much, in most cases, much better outcome if you can keep government closer to people. So the regulatory agencies, in my experience, do a really good job. I know in South Dakota, and I'm sure here in Ohio, probably the same thing is true. You've got good, strong regulatory frameworks, and they're concerned about being good stewards of the resources that we have. So, you know, there's certainly I'm not suggesting there isn't a role for the federal government to play. You've got to enforce, you know, federal environmental law. But to me, the idea that the federal government ought to be heaping on new regulations, coming up with ways to make it more costly, more burdensome to develop these energy sources that are available in many states around our country is a misguided notion. I think we need as much as we can to work with our states and make them the partners in a lot of this development.
Well, that makes a lot of sense, especially for our producers here in Ohio. They're looking for regulatory certainty.
Right.
And is that code always going to be changing? Is there some new law or some new regulation I have to comply with? How about the presidential election? What kind of role do you think the concept or the conversation of energy is going to play into that presidential politics?
I think it'll play a big role. There's no question that energy is a major issue for the country. It's probably one of the biggest expenses that any business deals with. It's certainly one of the biggest costs of doing business in South Dakota. We're very ag dependent. We're long distances, obviously a cold weather climate, and I'm sure here in Ohio that's true as well. I mean, when you're a business, if you've got keeping an affordable energy supply and a predictable energy supply, it is really critical. And so I think as these candidates talk about the economy, you can't help but talk about energy. And in my view, at least, there's a very clear choice when you've got a president currently whose administration is continually putting out policies that drive up the cost of energy production here in this country, have a regulatory framework that makes it more expensive to develop those types of energy sources. That's a real problem for our economy, and that's why, of course, I'm sure it's no secret, I'm supporting Governor Romney, because I think his approach, and all the above approach, that recognizes that we can't continue to saddle and burden and add additional weight to the businesses in this country by creating new regulations in Washington, D.C., many of which have very questionable and dubious value in terms of the things that they're trying to accomplish. So in my view, it's a clear choice, but I do think that presidential leadership, what's happening in Washington profoundly impacts the states, profoundly impacts what's happening in energy development around this country. And what we need to do is make it not more expensive, more difficult to develop energy here, but less expensive, less difficult, and try and, to the degree that we can, get out of the way, so to speak, if you will, and allow these great entrepreneurs out there to do what they do best.
Makes a lot of sense. And Senator, last question. One of our favorite topics is we often move around into our communities in Ohio and give presentations about oil and gas development, or talk to our community leaders or business leaders. There's a certain section of the crowd, a small minority, but they're anti-development. They're not for this industry, and sometimes we call them CAVE, C-A-V, Citizens Against Virtually Everything.
Right.
And whether you wanted to plant a rose garden in the middle of town, somebody would be against it. How would you, as an elected leader, talk to somebody? Again, we're not here to overlook their concerns. We want to address them, but want to make sure that it's a fact-based conversation. How would you advise that we, talk to folks about, hey, this is important. This is economic development. We need to do this. What would be some of your advice on that topic?
Well, there are some people that have their minds made up already, and you can't confuse them with facts. That makes it
that's true.
difficult.
Yeah.
But I think, Mike, the real answer is you've got to use, if you use facts, if you use, and let's allow science to drive a lot of these discussions, and not just make stuff up and allow emotion to drive that debate. But we have those in South Dakota too. Every state does, and unfortunately, it's sometimes folks on the extreme that get in the way of what is just very commonsensical to most Americans. And the Keystone Pipeline would be a good example of that.
Great example.
Something that the president vetoed, essentially, notwithstanding the fact that his own administration was advocating in support of it. And it makes sense for so many reasons on so many levels that those are the types of things that you want to see move forward, and yet you've got this very vocal minority of people who unfortunately have the ear of policymakers in Washington, D.C., and end up being a lot more successful than they should be at stopping things that are in the public interest and that would do a lot to help alleviate this dependence that we have on foreign energy.
That makes a lot of sense, and that's what our objective is, to go out into these communities and talk to folks and address their concerns and talk to the business leaders, the community leaders, saying, hey, what kind of questions can we answer for you? Let's talk about economic development. Let's talk about infrastructure development. See how important this is to really all over eastern Ohio. Well, Senator, I appreciate your time and your comments today. For more information, be sure to visit us at eidiohio.org. Senator, thank you very much.
Thanks, Mike. Appreciate it.
Thank you.